Camilla, can you hear me? Good morning, Miss Manning.
Good morning, Sophie. How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you great, loud and
Great.
clear.
Thank you.
Mr. Kanzinger, how are you doing today, sir?
What's up?
Nothing much. How about you? Check, check. How are we hearing me?
Better, thank you, Sophie.
Hi, Mr. Perry. How are you today, sir?
Enough, thanks for asking. Hope you're well.
What time is this 10 o'clock hearing at?
Any minute now, sir.
Thank you. Sophie, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Subcommittee of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism will come to order. Welcome, everyone. Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare recess of the subcommittee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record. subject to the length limitation in the rules. As a reminder to the members who are participating virtually, please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. Consistent with House rules, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they are not under recognition to eliminate background noise, not to avoid embarrassment. Pursuant to notice, the subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the State Department Counterterrorism Bureau's fiscal year 2022 budget. I see that we have a quorum. I'll recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. The purpose of this hearing is to conduct oversight of the Counterterrorism Bureau's budget request, as well as the Biden administration's overall counterterrorism policy priorities. I thank the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Coordinator Landberg for appearing today. In fiscal year 22, the administration requested a total of $248.8 million for the Counterterrorism Bureau, taking collectively from the Nader, ESF, American Salaries and Security Programs accounts, which is roughly in line with previous year's funding. And while the nature of terrorism is changing and evolving, the threat clearly has not dissipated. Looking at the FY22 request, we can reasonably conclude that the Biden administration is reprioritizing efforts to combat terrorism and violent extremism and is shifting away from a military-driven CT approach to one more rooted in diplomacy, cooperation, and engagement. As the focus of U.S. foreign policy moves towards great power competition, we must remain hyper-vigilant in our strategy, coordination, and action against terrorist and violent extremist threats that exist both abroad and at home. We must ensure that addressing root causes of terrorism and terrorist recruitment remains at the forefront of our CT strategy. The FY22 budget request for ESF funds has remained stagnant at $15 million. Programs funded by ESF focus on combating terrorist recruitment and the radicalization of individuals in partner countries by countering terrorist narratives and messaging, strengthening the capacity of partner governments and civil society organizations to prevent radicalization and recruitment to violence, and promoting effective rehabilitation and reintegration of former terrorists. These resources are essential to addressing systemic challenges, getting at the core of drivers of radicalization, and I hope to hear more about what your Bureau is doing in consultation with CSO, regional bureaus, USAID, and DoD to implement a holistic approach to address these challenges. This September marked the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and while we've made significant progress in preventing and combating terror threats, the United States still faces a wide array of challenges from jihadist organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Iranian-backed groups like Hezbollah, and the growing threat of REMV, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. The ISIS caliphate has been destroyed, but the organization maintains a network of supporters and foreign fighters who are trained by ISIS operatives and loyal to the organization's cause. I'm concerned by the trends of continued indoctrination and radicalization at refugee camps across the Middle East, as well as the risk of recruitment or kidnapping many internally displaced peoples face in places like Syria. Further, ISIS-AQ and their affiliated groups have continued to grow and spread not only within the Middle East, but also across Europe, Asia, and Africa, changing their tactics and continuing to apply pressure even as our partner capacity advances. I'm also deeply concerned by the seemingly emboldened Iranian-backed proxy groups. The United States has long considered Iran to be a state sponsor of terrorism, and its proxies, such as Hezbollah and Shia militias in Iraq, continue to sow chaos throughout the Middle East, threatening U.S. interests and military personnel, as well as our regional allies and partners. I was horrified to learn of the drone attack on the Iraqi Prime Minister earlier this month, and I'm interested to hear, interested to hear how the Bureau is thinking about both countering Iranian proxies as well as adapting to the threat of UAVs and other emerging technologies. Afghanistan, too, is on all of our minds today, and while I understand that, and I'll take the opportunity to remind my colleagues of this as well, certain topics may be challenging to speak about at length in a public setting. I look forward to hearing about how the events of this summer have changed the threat landscape in the region, our counterterrorism strategies, and the funding requests that we're speaking about today. I also look forward to continuing the conversation in a classified space in the coming weeks. Finally, combating racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, which encompasses individuals and groups motivated to violence by an intolerant ethno-supremacist ideology, including white supremacy and neo-Nazism, is a priority for me as well as I know for the Biden administration. The United Nations Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee cited a 320% increase in extreme right-wing terrorism globally since 2015. And while many argue that REMV is not as potent as jihadists or Iranian-backed terrorists, since it lacks the global networks that make both a potent threat, REMV is continuing to evolve and spread, with individuals and groups in different countries communicating, recruiting, radicalizing, and sharing tactical training, including weapon-making instructions both online and in person. What's more, white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups appear to be gaining wider public acceptance in some Western countries, with a commensurate rise in violent attacks. With that, I would ask unanimous consent to submit into the record an article from this morning from CNN.com entitled, "What a Staggering Gun Cache Discovered in One Suspected Neo-Nazi's House Says About Far-Right Extremism in Europe." Without objection. These trends are extremely concerning. I'm eager to learn more about how the Bureau is prepared to combat these threats globally and discuss the strategy produced by the Department as a result of legislation written by me and other members of this subcommittee. Mr. Landberg, we look forward to strengthening our understanding of how the State Department's resources are utilized to counter terrorism and violent extremism, and of course carry out these policies in accordance with our American values and respect for human rights. I also hope you'll identify areas where greater congressional support might be needed so we can work together to help keep the American people safe. And with that, I will recognize Ranking Member Wilson for purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Deutch, for holding this hearing today. The Department of State Counterterrorism Bureau has a major role in supporting our partners in combating terrorist extremism and identifying evolving threats. I appreciate the dedication of the men and women of the State Department to protect American families. Unfortunately, there is much to discuss regarding the global threat of terrorism. Sadly, we see with the recent attacks in the United Kingdom, the murder of Member of Parliament David Ames, and the explosion of the bomb Sunday outside the Liverpool's Women's Hospital, that the threat is ever present. Attacks have been perpetrated, beginning with the murder of 13 Marines in Kabul, from New Zealand to Norway, with heinous mass murder at mosque in Afghanistan, confirming the terrorist threat to religious institutions worldwide. Additionally, despite significant efforts made by the United States and our European partners, terrorist groups are capitalizing on localized civil unrest and gaining ground in the African continent. Undoubtedly, the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan will present a number of challenges as we see the resurgence of terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and the emergence of smaller, more extreme offshoots from the Islamic Invitation Alliance. Sadly, with no remaining U.S. military presence, counterterrorism efforts to confront this rapidly evolving situation will certainly be hindered. Those who think the Taliban terrorists have moderated need not look further than the cabinet that it has now, which includes Sirajuddin Haqqani, senior leader of the murderous Haqqani network, led by those who have committed some of the worst attacks on the United States and coalition forces, with the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister in Islamabad of Pakistan. The return of Afghanistan as a safe haven for terrorists is occurring today. And we also have persons who were released from Guantanamo as terrorists who now actually serve in the cabinet and today, sadly, in Kabul. One of the gravest threats to American families continues to be the Iranian regime. Unfortunately, it seems that this administration's policy is to lift sanctions on leading state sponsor of terrorism and hope for the best. Iran has no intention of shifting course as it continues to export terrorism and missiles around the globe with the mandate of death to America, death to Israel. Mr. Landberg, your written statement refers to the departure from military-led foreign policy to one led by diplomacy. But as history reminds, one cannot exist without the other. It is peace through strength. Last week, the Iraqi Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, survived an attempt on his life by an explosive drone, which was carried out by Iranian-backed militias. Sadly, it's only a matter of time before terrorism returns to America, with suicide bombers over the open southern border and weaponized drones capable of attacking any public building. The United States must maintain our commitment to fighting the evolving threat of terrorism and its causes. It is a global war on terrorism, which we cannot unilaterally exit. Thank you, Mr. Landberg, for your service, and I look forward to hearing from you on the Bureau's goals and where we can work together. And we have a bipartisan tradition here. I appreciate the leadership of Chairman Ted Deutch. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, and I'll now introduce our witness. Chris Landberg is the acting principal deputy coordinator for the Bureau of Counterterrorism. In addition to this, he also serves as the deputy coordinator for crisis response and technical policy, where he provides oversight of the CT Bureau's Office of Technical Programs and Operations Policy, as well as the Office of Crisis Response, Preparedness, and Special Coordination. It's a lot of responsibility. Mr. Landberg, before joining the CT Bureau, Mr. Landberg held senior positions at our embassy in Bogota, where he helped bolster Colombia's law enforcement, military, and judicial capabilities to assist the country in their fight against crime and drug trafficking, and worked as a senior staffer in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Landberg, I'll remind you that you should limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared remarks will be made part of the hearing record. Thanks so much for being here, and you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, and esteemed members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the State Department Bureau of Counterterrorism's program and policy priorities and discuss the fiscal year 2022 resources we need to protect America's security at home and interests abroad from terrorist threats, and also how they align with the Biden-Harris administration's broader counterterrorism priorities.
Mr. Landberg, excuse me, can you pull the mic a little closer, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Would you like me to start again or just continue? Okay. The FY22 budget comes at a time when we are shifting from a U.S. military-led counterterrorism approach to one rooted in diplomacy, partnerships, and multilateral engagement. The CT Bureau will play a critical role in this evolving approach as we promote counterterrorism cooperation, strengthen partnerships, and build civilian capacity to counter the full spectrum of terrorist threats confronting the United States and our allies. CT's budget request is not just shaped by U.S. national security interests, but is also driven by the terrorist landscape, which is more dynamic, complex, and fast-moving than ever before. Terrorist groups remain a persistent and pervasive threat, despite our great progress in degrading their ability to threaten the U.S. homeland. ISIS's global presence, including that of its branches and networks, continues to grow despite a destruction of its so-called caliphate and also our complete liberation of territory it once controlled in Iraq and Syria. Al-Qaeda and its affiliates also remain an enduring threat, capable of inflicting damage on our allies and global interests despite significant leadership losses. Iran and its proxies, including Hezbollah, continue to engage in dangerous and destabilizing activity in the Middle East and beyond. And finally, we are also facing a major and growing threat from racially or ethnically motivated violent extremist actors. What are we doing to address these diverse threats? CT, or the CT Bureau, is leading the international diplomatic campaign against ISIS, including the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters and associated family members. The Office of the Special Envoy to the Defeat ISIS Coalition was formally merged into CT this year, and the CT coordinator is now dual-hatted as the U.S. Special Envoy. The coalition remains central to the international community's efforts against ISIS. In the wake of the tragic suicide bombing in Kabul on August 26, we quickly convened the de-ISIS coalition leadership and together are developing collective measures to counter ISIS Khorasan, or ISIS-K. CT is also engaged in mobilizing the international community against al-Qaeda, reminding our partners that the group remains capable and highly dangerous. CT has spearheaded a diplomatic campaign against Hezbollah, urging governments globally to take steps to recognize the group in its entirety as a terrorist organization and to restrict its activities in their countries. And finally, CT is playing a key role in countering transnational aspects of the REMV threat. In February, the Secretary designated the CT coordinator as department lead for REMV-related issues. We have developed a new comprehensive department strategy and have been involved in the development and implementation of the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism. Focusing on our capacity building efforts, as we shift from a military-heavy approach and rely more on diplomacy and partners, it will be even more critical to help these partners build their civilian counterterrorism expertise and capacity. We are helping them secure their borders to counter terrorist travel, investigate and disrupt terrorist plots, track terrorist financing, bring terrorists to justice, prevent and counter violent extremism, and rehabilitate and reintegrate former terrorists. Since 2016, the Counterterrorism Partnerships Fund, or CTPF, resources have allowed us to surge assistance and make gains with some of our most important partners. The FY22 CTPF request includes funding that will allow us to maintain our successful programs and respond to areas of growing concern. The FY22 request also includes funding for the Personal Identification Secure Comparison and Evaluation System, or PISES program. Additional funding for this program will allow us to enhance efforts of partner countries' law enforcement, foster collaboration with Interpol, and expand the PISES program. Our FY22 request also includes funding for counter-violent extremism, or CVE, programs, which are integral to assist our partners to prevent terrorist groups from recruiting new members and help rehabilitate and reintegrate foreign terrorist fighters. In my written testimony, I've provided examples of where our efforts have had concrete results. So Chairman Deutch, Ranking Member Wilson, protecting the United States and our interests against terrorist threats is our top priority. We greatly appreciate the resources Congress has appropriated to us in the past fiscal years for this important mission, especially your strong support for CTPF. These resources are vital to ensuring our partners remain committed and have the tools they need to sustain the fight against terrorist organizations. And I look forward to your questions on our discussion this morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Landberg. We'll now move to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I will defer and therefore yield to the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and Mr. Landberg, like you, a former professional staffer from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Connolly, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Okay, we will come back to Mr. Connolly, and I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Manning. Landberg, I like to think that there is no hack into our system today as the CT discussion takes place. But while we work that out, I'm going to continue to defer, and I'm going to yield to my friend, the ranking member, for 5 minutes to ask questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Landberg, thank you for being here. And actually, I was looking forward to hearing from President Connolly, so that'll be later. But as we address issues today, Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. In fact, it's the leading world sponsor of terrorism. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And additionally, we need to confirm, but Iran's central bank, its national oil company, its national tanker company, its national petrochemical company, and the other host of banks and companies that today are subject to U.S. sanctions support terrorism. Is that correct?
Sir, they're definitely involved with the Iranian government in activities. Whether those specific entities are involved, I'd have to take that question.
And with that, I am concerned that the Biden administration may be lifting terrorism sanctions on any of these banks or companies as part of an agreement that does not include a behavioral change on terrorism. That is, an agreement focused solely on the nuclear program with no change to Iran's financing of terrorism or the IRGC. It would be safe to assume these banks and companies would still fund terrorism if there's not sanctions. Is that right?
Sir, I'm not aware of alleviating sanctions on any group related to Iran that would be involved in terrorism.
That's encouraging, and that's the way it should be in a bipartisan manner. Additionally, I was visiting the southern border a couple of weeks ago at Del Rio, and I learned that names on the terrorist watch list have crossed into the United States. How many people on the terrorist watch list have crossed the southern border from Mexico into Texas, Arizona, California?
Sir, I think for a specific number, I would refer you to DHS. but I'm happy to take the question as well and talk to them.
But there have been terrorist watch list persons coming across. That's correct?
So, you know, I know that we work very closely with Mexico to track travel, and we have a sort of a layered defensive approach internationally. Whether there have been individuals that have crossed, I think I would have to refer you to DHS.
And another issue, less than a month ago, the Undersecretary of Defense Colin Kahl discussed with the Senate Armed Services Committee members that intelligence community assessed that both ISIS-K and al-Qaeda intend to conduct external operations, including against the United States. Reports indicate that ISIS-K and al-Qaeda could possess the capability within a year to strike American families in the United States. What actions are being taken by the Bureau to account for the near-term concerns?
So I think Undersecretary Kahl said that they have the intent, not at the moment, not the capability. General Mingus, the J3 at the Joint Staff, was with him, said that the IC assessments about ISIS-K becoming a threat to external threat to the United States within 6 to 12 months and AQ within 1 to 2 years are without pressure. So I think we are working collectively in the U.S. government to ensure there is pressure on both of those groups to lengthen those periods where they would be able to do external plotting against the United States.
And what is the status of the administration urging the European Union as well as other European member states to designate all of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization and to sanction it? What is the hesitancy of some of our European allies to designate Hezbollah, particularly obviously in Lebanon, and the threat that it has by way of rockets against the people of Israel?
Well, sir, I will say that we have had many discussions with Europeans about not just designating them the military, what they have designated the military side of Hezbollah. We've had a lot of success working with partners around the world over the last 2 years in particular to get them to designate Hezbollah as a whole group. And I'd be happy to respond to a question for the record of more detail about what their specific concerns might be.
And it's really sad to me that, in fact, in Latin America, only 5 countries have designated Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Are there discussions underway with our regional neighbors to adopt a framework to sanction the Hezbollah terrorists that are such a threat to the people of Israel?
Yes, sir, there are, and it's been quite successful. In 2018, we started an annual ministerial, Western Hemisphere ministerial, focused on counterterrorism. We hosted the first one, then Argentina the next one, then Colombia, and next spring it's going to be in Peru and Lima, and those are always opportunities to talk to our counterparts about designating Hezbollah and countering
And
Hezbollah.
with the issue of Hezbollah, also Hamas, with 4,400 rockets this year from Gaza, what's being done to work with our allies and others to sanction Hamas?
Sir, while I believe that Hamas is also a designated organization, and so we work with all of our partners to counter the activities of these organizations, especially related to their financing.
Thank you very much, and my time is up, but thank you for your service and thank you for the State Department personnel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. I believe Representative Manning can now be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch and Ranking Member Wilson, for organizing today's very important hearing. It is vital that Congress and the administration continue to work together to identify and increase dedicated resources to confronting the evolving terrorist threats worldwide. I want to pick up on something that Ranking Member Wilson was discussing, and that is, of course, the concerns about Hezbollah and about Hamas. And Mr. Landberg, you did mention that there are efforts to counter the activities of Hamas. But one of the things that I found particularly concerning about the recent conflict in Gaza was the determination that most of the 4,500 rockets that were fired by Hamas at Israel were actually produced in Gaza. Can you talk to us? You know, you mentioned trying to stop the foreign assistance, but can you talk about what efforts are being made to make sure that Hamas does not continue to have the ability and the materials to produce weapons right there in Gaza?
Thank you, Representative. We work really closely with Israel.
Is your mic on?
Can you hear me?
Just making sure your microphone is on.
It is. I'll move this closer. Sorry. So we work very closely with Israel on a whole range of counterterrorism initiatives, including related to technology that's being used by terrorist groups against Israel and other partners in the region. That includes unaccompanied air vehicles, that includes rockets, and we do quite a bit of work on technological aspects of that. And so I'd be happy to get into more detail in a different setting or take a question for the record that I can answer in a classified response. Over.
Thank you. And we know, we do want to make sure that humanitarian assistance gets to the Palestinian people who need help, but how can we make sure that that assistance gets to the right place and it does not end up in the hands of Hamas for rebuilding tunnels, for example?
Thank you. So just generally, when it comes to humanitarian assistance, we monitor very closely to make sure that when we have designated groups that that does not impede the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We're confident that in most or almost all cases that is the case. But we're confident that the organizations which are very experienced, especially working in those types of environments that are engaged in humanitarian assistance, can work with us to make sure that it doesn't fall in the wrong hands and definitely gets to the right people.
Thank you. You mentioned that you work very closely with Israel on these issues. Can you talk more generally about how does the Bureau of Counterterrorism allocate resources to balance between helping bolster our partners' capabilities to disrupt and dismantle terrorist networks on their own and countering violent extremism to prevent these terrorist threats from taking root in the first place?
Thank you. So with Israel, we don't provide assistance because they're a higher income country. So our initiatives with them are more focused on collaboration. But just generally, we use our assistance for a whole range of activities that include everything from prevention, so that's countering violent extremism, to building law enforcement capabilities of our partners so they can actually do counterterrorism crisis response, to also working in the judicial sector to help the judicial sector actually do investigations and prosecutions, and even work like on the incarceration of terrorists, which would be related to, for example, trying to preclude radicalization in the prisons. So we work on the whole spectrum of counterterrorism with our partners. With some countries, we focus more on some aspects, and in some countries, it's the whole spectrum. But we use assistance in every part of the chain of terrorism in building our partners' capabilities.
Thank you. One of the things that we have grown increasingly concerned about is the ability of terrorist groups or would-be terrorist activists interacting on the internet. And terrorist groups have become increasingly sophisticated at using the internet to fuel recruitment, radicalization. And in recent years, we know ISIS has posted videos on TikTok. Al-Qaeda has developed a new website to disseminate terrorist content around the world. What is the State Department's strategy for countering this potent source of terrorism and extremism? And does the Bureau have the resources necessary to do so?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. Terrorist use of the internet is something we've been focused on for quite a while. It actually affects both sort of a traditional kind of CVE programming and our REMV programming. We generally are approaching radicalization via the internet by working with social media companies directly, often to help them or to encourage them to enforce their terms of service, encouraging them to work with, especially the larger social media companies, to work with smaller companies, and then also encouraging those companies to support initiatives to do positive content to counter the negative content. Our experience and research has shown that responding with positive content tends to work best. So terrorist use of the internet is something that we're very focused on. We work with partners through multiple organizations. We recently joined the Christchurch Call to Action to counter radical speech online, and so this is an area of intense focus by both the CT Bureau and the U.S. government.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Mast from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Deutch. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time today. You were with the State Department under President Trump as well?
Yes.
What was your position when you were with State under President Trump?
So I was for the first 3 years, I was the head of the counter-narcotics operation in Bogota.
First 3 years, what is that?
First 3 years of the Trump administration.
Not of
and
your
then the
career
last
with
year,
state.
I was a deputy assistant secretary in the Counterterrorism Bureau.
Got it. When the embassy in Afghanistan was evacuated in an emergency way, was that under the Trump administration or the Biden administration?
That was under the Biden administration.
When Bagram was evacuated, which was followed on by retreating into a not wholly protected airport, resulting in the death of 13 of our U.S. service members and hundreds of others killed and injured from other countries. Was that under the Trump administration or the Biden administration?
Under the current administration.
On April 14th, President Biden announced leaving Afghanistan on September 11th, probably the date most synonymous with terrorism in the United States of America. What did you think about announcing September 11th as a withdrawal date from Afghanistan?
Well, I have a long history working in and on Afghanistan. I'll be honest, I think, looking back, I wish over many administrations we'd made fewer mistakes and that we had left in a better way.
Totally agree. What did you think about leaving on September 11?
I guess I wasn't, I thought the deadline really that we were looking at was August 31st.
Okay. President Biden said September 11. He said that on April 14.
Okay.
Let me move to another question. On August 19th, President Biden was doing an interview with George Stephanopoulos, and he said, "We will stay until everyone is out." Did we stay until everybody was out?
We continue to work to get everybody out.
Did we stay?
Well, my understanding is that, I think I need to say it this way. My understanding is that determination was made that if we stayed beyond August 31st, it would be more difficult to get everyone out and more dangerous. So no, when we left, not everyone was out. We continue to aggressively get the people out who need to get out, especially American citizens.
I thank you for your candor. I want to move a little bit to the Haqqani Network, the remains of the Haqqani Network, the implications of members of the Haqqani Network, a designated terrorist organization holding positions in the new Taliban government, and what you think our engagement in that shadow should be with the Taliban government. And you can expound on that, and there's a number of directions you could go, but I'm asking about that.
Absolutely, and we're concerned. Siraj Haqqani is Minister of Interior. We're obviously concerned with that. We've been very clear at all levels about what we expect from the Taliban.
Be more specific, please. You're concerned. That's a big umbrella of things that could be potential problems.
From the President, the Secretary of State, other members of the Cabinet, we've been clear with the Taliban what we expect from them, right? Especially on counterterrorism. What was in the Doha Agreement was that they cannot allow Afghanistan to become a safe haven, but that includes no training, no financing, no allowing foreign fighters to go back and forth, no external plotting. That's what we expect, right? That's what they can earn legitimacy with us and the international community if that's what they fulfill. So it's on them. The onus is on them. And no, we understand that there are members of their group that are from Haqqani, which was a mostly internally focused organization. But our greater concerns with regards to terrorism emanating from Afghanistan are ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda.
You're leading the CT Bureau. That's serious. And so your opinion on this is a valuable opinion. Should the U.S. recognize a government that includes designated terrorists?
We have no obligation to recognize the Taliban government. It will be determined over time. They know exactly what they have to do in terms of allowing freedom of movement, allowing people to leave, ensuring protection of human rights and civil liberties, and especially on counterterrorism. They know exactly what they need to do to earn legitimacy over time. At this moment, we don't feel any obligation to recognize them, and it's generally been U.S. practice not to do so after a change of government like this.
Thank you for your candor.
I now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service. I just wanted to delve into counterterrorism finance aspects of your responsibility, and in particular, how would you describe the partnerships that we have going forward? Are we continuing to bolster the capacity for our partner countries? How are we dealing with what is a stronger global threat by working with particularly our transatlantic allies as well? Could you go into that in a little greater depth, please?
Sure. So counterterrorism finance has been one of our priority lines of effort for a very long time. It's been very successful. We use designations in particular for foreign terrorist organizations, especially designated global terrorist organizations and individuals, to help to block terrorist financing, and that we work with our partners for them to also designate and also obviously work within the UN. It's been a successful area of cooperation internationally, and we've had quite a bit of success. This year, one of the things we've done is we've integrated CTF funding into our broader CTPF line of funding, which allows us to have integrated programs to help build capabilities, not just specifically on counterterrorism financing, but like we can work with prosecutors in a country to build their broader counterterrorism capabilities, but include specific training on counterterrorism financing. So I think this approach that we're going to be taking going forward with the current budget that we've requested, I think is going to give us more flexibility and have more success.
And generally, what do you determine, what are you seeing in terms of white supremacist type extremism behavior? How are you able to contract? I know that's happening, expanding. We have our own issues in the U.S., but also Central Eastern Europe and that expanding area. How do you see some of that cooperation going?
I'm sorry. I think I heard you ask about, was it REMV-related terrorism? Is that what you were asking? Sorry.
White identity terrorism.
White identity terrorism.
Growing.
Yeah, so we have a long history of working on counter-violent extremism, and we're building on a lot of the lessons learned, which also include our countering terrorist use of the internet. So with REMV, or white identity terrorism, we're working closely with partners, but essentially we're using designations just like we do elsewhere. We're trying to block travel. We're using diplomatic engagement. There are a number of international organizations that we have helped to create, which are ways we can build capabilities of partners to deal with REMV or violent extremist organizations. And you know, we're also building capabilities directly. And then we've started something that we've modeled on a really successful program we have in countering Hezbollah, which is a law enforcement forum where we bring together law enforcement partners, especially from countries like some of our European partners, to focus on trends and share information. We are doing that in the REMV space, where white identity terrorism is part of that, where we're bringing together, you know, we'll have DHS and DOJ on our side, along with State Department, and they'll have their equivalents, and they'll come and share information about how we can counter that
Has there been more
developing threat.
difficulty in that regard in areas where there's been some democratic backsliding in terms of the rule of law issues? Because to work with prosecutors and work with their criminal justice investigators, you know, have you noticed any slippage due to democratic backsliding in that enforcement cooperation and participation?
So I think there, when we looked at, for example, the sub-Saharan Africa space, you know, there's some concerns. When it comes to our assistance, first of all, human rights and civil liberties are built into everything we do. We do a lot of vetting related to that. So when there might be concerns, we are going to react really quickly to try to pressure our partners to change their approach, or if we have to discontinue our work in that area.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too share your passion for, I guess, hatred of neo-Nazis and all that represents. My mama lost a brother fighting the Nazis in the Second World War, and I'm constantly reminded of that. I've got a 48-star flag that was draped over his casket, and not a day went by that my mama didn't refer to her brother, Roy, And so I appreciate that, and anything I can do to sign on anything, I would appreciate that opportunity, brother. Really would. Sir, I've asked this question, and thank you for being here, brother. I've asked this question in the past committee hearings, and I really didn't receive a satisfactory answer. There are recent reports that U.S.-trained former Afghan security personnel are joining ISIS-K because they are the strongest group still fighting the Taliban. How do you think this plays out in Afghanistan, and how does this complicate our efforts to stamp out terrorism in the country?
Thank you. I think we're going to have a classified briefing in early December. I think some sensitive issues like that is something we could talk about at that point. I would say generally it's a dynamic environment, and there are people joining different groups. Our focus is on countering ISIS-K, ensuring that they do not develop external operations plotting capabilities, and over the longer term, making sure that Al-Qaeda is not able to use Afghanistan as a safe haven to do the same. We're working with all our partners to make that happen. So we're very focused on that. ISIS-K, what they're doing on recruiting, I think maybe, and what happened after some of the prison breakouts, we could talk about that in early December in that briefing.
Okay. Okay, this next question kind of hits close to home to me because because of a constituent of mine. It was Staff Sergeant Ryan Knaus. He was listed as the last person to die of the 13, so he was the last person to actually die in Afghanistan. And he died, well, of course, when the Hamid Karzai International Airport was attacked and the botched withdrawal, whatever. But it's been reported that the suicide bomber in the attack was released from the Bagram Air Base when the Taliban took control. What are the near-term and long-term counterterrorism implications of these prison breaks conducted by the Taliban during their summer offensive?
Thank you. That was a devastating attack, and there were 13 enlisted, killed, and many wounded as well. And I think I want to point that out. How I think we need to be worried about the breakouts and how that led to increasing the ranks of ISIS-K. The prison itself was called the DFIP, the detention facility in Parwan near Bagram. It was run by the Afghans. When they left their posts and they got out, I mean that many of those prisoners have now joined the ranks of ISIS-K. It's something that we're really closely monitoring. I think I'll say this, that I think the Taliban are very motivated to go after ISIS-K as well. And so I think what we're seeing is increased activity by ISIS-K, for sure, within Afghanistan, but increased Taliban efforts to counter that threat. So we're looking at it really closely. I think our priority is always going to be the external operations plotting, which at this point we don't fully see, but certainly it's our major concern going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the remainder of time, but I would say that we still don't have the proper refreshments in the break rooms. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And I put that in the form of a motion. A Dr. Pepper or a Mountain Dew would go a long ways, Mr. Chairman. I know you're a giver, so I appreciate you.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchett.
Thank you, brother, for
the
being
ranking
here.
member and I will take that under advisement. I'll now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Vargas from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I didn't realize you were a giver like that. Fantastic. Director, I appreciate very much your testimony today. I do want to ask you some questions, if I could, about potential help that we could get. Just recently, I returned from a congressional delegation to Indonesia, and I didn't realize that they had a Ministry of Religious Affairs. Are you familiar with that ministry?
I'm sorry, in what country was that, sir? I couldn't quite hear it.
Indonesia.
Indonesia?
Yes.
Did you hear me? Sorry, I wasn't personally aware of that.
Oh, okay. The reason I asked that, it was fascinating, really. When I first heard of the ministry, I suspected it wasn't going to be something that was very positive. It turned out something I found very interesting. What they attempt to do through this ministry, and frankly, everyone that I met in the ministry was Muslim, they attempt to harmonize the religions in Indonesia. In particular, they try to make sure that that there's no radicalization. And they seem to have been pretty effective so far. And that's why I was curious if you had any information about that or any collaboration with them.
Sir, I'm happy to take that question back. We have a really strong counter-violent extremism team. They work with a lot of different organizations that work with communities and including religious leaders on exactly this type of counter-radicalization efforts. And I'm sure that they're familiar with this, and I'd be happy to give you more detail.
I think it is important to take a look at what other nations are doing. As you know, Indonesia is the largest Muslim nation in the world, and they haven't been afflicted with all the terrorism that we've seen in other countries in the Middle East. And again, speaking to the minister and his aides, I was very impressed with what they do to try to harmonize and also to take a look at the troublemakers and either work with them or have them under surveillance. But again, I think it's been very effective for them.
Sir, I wanted to point out that Indonesia is actually a member of the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the GCTF, which is an organization we set up years ago, been highly successful in bringing many countries. It's about 30 members, kind of core members. They coordinate on exactly this type of thing. So Indonesia has actually been a leader in the GCTF, including on these issues. Over.
I would also bring up that we met with the foreign minister, who's a woman, and we talked to her about having her meet with Taliban and have a stronger presence. I mean, it was very fascinating to be in such a Muslim country and have so many women involved in government and have a woman in charge of the foreign ministry and super capable, super impressive, and very, very well respected in her country and certainly in the region. We should team up with her more and more to see if we can help in Afghanistan with women and with girls. I think she also would be a great force to make sure that there isn't the radicalization that you see in other countries.
Well, thank you. Certainly take that back. I think just generally, when we think about rehabilitation and reintegration of radicalized individuals or foreign fighters that are returning to their homelands, women often play a really key role, both in the helping to rehabilitate and reintegrate, but also just in catching or getting ahead of the whole radicalization cycle early on. So in all of our counter-violent extremism work, women play a key role. We also are working with women in law enforcement, and one of the things we've been really pressing, we have an Empower program where we press for more higher level professionalization of women law enforcement members. So it's two areas that we've been working on pretty consistently.
And lastly, I would say this, I heard your comments and responses to Congresswoman Manning about Israel, and I hope we do collaborate closely with them. I think they're a great, of course, ally of ours, a great friend, and I hope that we do more and more work with them. I think, again, they do an excellent job. They're in a very dangerous neighborhood, and we're very good friends, obviously. And so anyway, I hope that our collaboration becomes closer and closer. I know you said that because they are a higher income nation, we don't give them much financial support, but certainly I hope we get more collaboration with them. I know they're anxious to work with us.
Yeah, they don't need the financial support, but we collaborate both on specific initiatives, but also just generally, there's very close cooperation. Israel faces a lot of terrorism-related threats, Hezbollah being just one of them. And I mentioned what we're doing on countering Hezbollah's activities globally. So I think, there's really close cooperation just between our governments on counterterrorism issues, but specifically with the CT Bureau, we interact with our Israeli counterparts on a regular basis.
My time is up. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. I hope you continue that. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Kinzinger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here, everybody. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'm sorry if they've been repeated. I unfortunately had other commitments. I couldn't be on for the whole hearing, but appreciate your willingness to be here. One of the first things I want to say is I think we need to continue. For some reason, it's always been kind of slow to progress, but we need to continue to push for alliances with India, particularly in the region that we're talking about, given how difficult that is. I want to ask you a few questions about Pakistan. I think it's hard to discuss the failures in Afghanistan without Pakistan. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen every administration attempt to appease Islamabad. A few months ago, there were reports of Pakistani drones helping the Taliban fight against both Afghan forces and National Resistance Front in the Panjshir Valley. How can we hold Pakistan accountable for the Taliban's armed coup? And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. The legitimately elected government of Afghanistan is not the Taliban. So how can we hold them accountable for the coup of a democratically elected government? And should the administration reconsider Pakistan's status as a major non-NATO ally?
Thank you. So some of this I'd be happy to get into in more detail in early December when we have a classified session. But I'll say this. I mean, Pakistan has played a complex role in all of this, has suffered greatly as well, has serious concerns about terrorism activity emanating, and not just terrorism activity, but instability emanating from Afghanistan. So they are an important country for us to work with. I believe as in the SASC hearing when Undersecretary Kyle was discussing how we work closely with Pakistan on everything related to doing over-the-horizon counterterrorism. So, that is an important partnership going forward. We're actually trying to enhance our discussions, specifically with the State Department lead with Pakistan on counterterrorism. That said, we're very clear on our expectations for Pakistan, and we'll work with them closely where we can. There are other areas where our interests might diverge, and then we'll be clear about that, and we'll make sure that we're defending United States core values and interests.
Well, let me ask that. You mentioned the over-the-horizon capabilities. I think there's no doubt that, leaving Afghanistan, which I oppose, but I understand there's, positions on both sides. We are where we are. But we lost a lot of contact. I mean, obviously with Afghan special forces, intel assets, and a lot of real view into the rise of extremism. We tout this over-the-horizon capability. Is the administration, in your view, committed to defending the homeland should a threat arise out of Afghanistan, a real threat to the United States? And let me add to that, where do you see, given the difficulties we've had, where do you see Afghanistan in 5 or 10 years in your mind?
So first answer is yes. I believe the administration is extremely committed to ensuring, and I think the President, certainly Secretary of State have both said, and I think Secretary Austin as well, have been very clear that we will do what's necessary to ensure that we're disrupting, deterring, and degrading any terrorist threat that would, to the United States in particular. Yes, that commitment is there. I would like to point out that when it comes to the Counterterrorism Bureau, when we are working on over-the-horizon activities, a lot of what we do is actually counterterrorism cooperation with countries in the region. So our focus is really more on helping our partners in the region control their borders, disrupt any possible plotting, deter foreign fighter flows crossing their borders, and improve their law enforcement capabilities. So that's where we focus. Where Afghanistan goes in 5 years depends completely on whether the Taliban is willing to meet the expectations of not just the United States, but really the international community and what they need to do. And I did mention what they were before, and I'd be happy to go through that again, but...
No, that's fine. Look, I appreciate that. I know it's a tough position. I do want to mention the last 30 seconds I have. I read an article today. I forget where it was at, but it was talking about the mental health impacts on State Department employees. And I think it's important to point that out. It's, as a military guy, we get a lot of focus of, mental health effects on the military, rightfully so, law enforcement, everybody. But I think, given the tragedy of what happened in Afghanistan at the end, thinking of these employees on the phone dealing with these issues, I do think it's important to mention. And so please pass my best to everybody. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. We've all been working on Afghanistan for years, very committed. Some of us, maybe me, obsessed. It's been a hard period, but everybody's been volunteering, doing overnights, worked very hard. Very proud of my fellow State Department colleagues.
Me too. Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. I want to associate myself with Mr. Kinzinger's comments and concern and appreciation for our dedicated State Department employees. And I'm pleased to yield to Ms. Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for letting me unofficially join your subcommittee. Mr. Landberg, thank you for testifying today on this topic. It's great to see you again. I want to dig into how the Bureau is incorporating lessons learned and the latest research. As I think we might have talked about, when I worked at the State Department, we did a study on the factors that drive violent extremism, which found that much of the conventional wisdom on what causes violent extremism is not actually validated. So it's not poverty, it's not income inequality, it's not madrasa education. Rather, we found that there's empirical evidence of a link between violent extremism and factors like state repression and an absence of civil liberties. Since I left the State Department, there have been multiple studies that have continued to come out that show that one of the key drivers of violent extremism is the abuse or the perception of abuse by government authorities, including a 2018 study funded by the EU and the UN that found that the most determining factor contributing to vulnerability or resilience to violent extremism in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is the experience or perception of abuse and violation by government authorities. A 2017 study done by UNDP found that confronting extremism with heavy-handed or extrajudicial law enforcement is likely to backfire by inflaming real or perceived socioeconomic cleavages and exclusionist narratives that are used by violent extremist groups. And so I was wondering, how is the Bureau incorporating lessons learned and research and analysis on preventing and countering violent extremism into your policies and programs? And to what extent are you looking at the abuses or perception abuses as root causes of violent extremism and how you're doing your program design and overall strategy?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Absolutely agree with you, and I think that's how we see it, that human rights violations and restrictions on civil liberties are certainly drivers of radicalization, absolutely. And I think what we see is a lot of, when we talk about ISIS and Al-Qaeda expanding in places like sub-Saharan Africa, they're moving into places where there's lack of good governance. They're moving into places that are sort of uncontrolled, but also they're taking advantage of exploiting local grievances often to build their brand. So I think that's something we're really seeing. Our monitoring and evaluation efforts, I think, is one of the big successes of the last few years for the Counterterrorism Bureau. We've dramatically increased how we're both doing the internal monitoring, and we've added resources. And in our budget request, we're actually requesting 3 more positions that will help us with program oversight. And then on the evaluation side, we do a lot of contracting now. And I'll just point out one contract that we had with RAND, where they evaluated our prison programs. And they actually found out that a lot of what we were doing, I think like what you're talking about, was probably not that effective. And so we used that study to then help alter how we're approaching, de-radicalization or counter-radicalization efforts in the prisons. And so that's one example of how we're trying to do a better job, and I think we have been improving every year.
Well, that is music to my ears, and certainly a change from when I worked with you all. I was wondering if actually on the MNE, if you could talk a little bit more about how you're measuring the effectiveness. What key indicators are you looking at? What surveys are you using? And in particular, how are you measuring outcomes versus just the outputs?
So I think a fulsome answer is probably maybe in writing.
Sure.
Happy to take that. What I can tell you is that we have multiple contracts ongoing to evaluate different aspects of our programs. What we're trying to do is measure, we have in our program design, we have what the outcomes are. And when we're not meeting those outcomes or where we see problems, or when we see our partners aren't fulfilling their side of the deal, or when we see concerns, for example, related to human rights, that's when we're able to use these results to alter. Happy to give you also summaries of those evaluations. The evaluations themselves are often very sensitive, but happy to give you more information.
Wonderful. I will look forward to reading that. I guess just on that point, what kind of feedback loops exist between local civil society organizations and the folks in DC who are designing these programs, and either the M&E portion or just the program design itself?
Okay. So really quickly, sorry. There are multiple organizations we work through. I think you're familiar with Hidayah, Strong Cities Network, GSURF, International Institute of Justice, and obviously the GCTF, which is sort of like the mothership for all those organizations. And we do constant program implementation and evaluation, and then there's natural feedback loops in those organizations. So I think that's where you see it happening, and I think it's been fairly a good process, and I think which is why we're helping to implement sort of better CV programming.
Well,
we're trying to then also use that when we're looking at the REMB threat as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I will look forward to reading your written response, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Thanks for joining us today. I'll now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch, and thank you for having this important hearing. I'm very grateful. And Mr. Landberg, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I want to start with, in June of this year, the Biden administration released a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Can you elaborate a little bit on how the CT Bureau's role, what role CT Bureau played in this strategy?
Yes, sir, very easily. Our authorities start at the water's edge and look out. So our involvement was everything related to the transnational linkages of domestic groups with international groups. So that was our focus on the domestic strategy. So we weren't the main piece of this, but we play a very important role in tracking of all that international activity of concern.
Great. And just building on that, the Bureau's actions on REMB, the internationally fighting terrorism in other countries, how does the interagency coordination look in that respect?
You said the interagency coordination?
Interagency, yes.
I think excellent. One of the things that we are working on very closely with DHS and DOJ is, I mentioned a little bit earlier, a law enforcement forum focused on REMB. So this would be something that we work, especially with European partners, but partners around the world that are dealing with sort of a growing REMB actor problem. And this is going to be, all three of our agencies working together. It's a forum that's useful for sharing information about trends, and then coordinating our activities. So I think that's a perfect example of how I think you have very strong interagency coordination.
Great, thank you. And expanding on that, we have our own issue here in the United States with REMB. How does the U.S. response here at home and the implications it's having at home, how does that affect the work you're doing with countries abroad?
Well, the way it affects it is that I think what we have seen is growing transnational linkages among these groups. So that is our main concern. So there's communication, which is quite hard to track. There is efforts to train and share information that's helpful between these groups. So this growing transnational connectivity is what we're most focused on, and that's why the State Department's, and especially the CT Bureau's work is enabling our partners and building their capabilities, and using other tools, for example, like designations and also countering terrorist travel, are so important.
Sure. And are there things that we can do in Congress? You have the tools currently, but are there other tools or other steps that Congress can take to help assist that effort?
Sir, I guess maybe the best thing would be for me to respond to you in writing on that.
Fair enough. Let me shift gears and talk about the Middle East. We see continuing cause for concern by action Iran's taking, not just in their nuclear program, which is alarming enough, but in their support for terrorism groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hamas in Gaza. their actions in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen as well. You touch on this in your opening statement. Again, specifically the work you're doing to try to push back there and things that we might be able to do to advance that work as well.
Yeah, sure. So we have multiple, Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism. We have multiple initiatives ongoing to work to counter those activities, the terrorist-related activities that Iran might be supporting or is supporting. That includes all of our counter-Hezbollah work, which it's a designated organization, so a lot of it is counterterrorism finance related to Hezbollah. But we work really closely with many partners. Just over the last few years, 14 of our partners have designated Hezbollah in its entirety. We have a Western Hemisphere initiative where we have annual summits where we share information and talk about Hezbollah activities. We also are working to counter different groups that they might be supporting. We've designated many of the organizations that you're talking about, including what we call Iran-aligned militia groups or IMGs or Shia groups operating in Iraq, for example, KH and AH. So through designations, through work with our partners, we have, I think we have a pretty extensive multiple lines of effort to counter those activities.
Great. Staying on that for a second, and in particular Hezbollah, 7 years ago I was proud to help author the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. We're 7 years later. Do you have a sense of how that act is holding up the test of time, and are there more steps that we can or should be taking to box in and constrain Hezbollah and support Lebanon?
Sir, I have experts on that. I think to get you a precise answer, but I will say that just generally on counter Hezbollah financing activities, we've made pretty significant strides, especially in Latin America, but also with our European partners to counter Hezbollah's illicit economic activities just broadly.
Great, thank you. And with that, I'm out of time. Again, Chairman Deutch, thanks for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
My pleasure.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Schneider. I yield to Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman Deutch and Ranking Member Wilson, for holding today's hearing on a really important issue. And thank you to Mr. Landberg for being here today and for the work of the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism in countering violent extremism, which is making the United States and the entire world a safer place. Mr. Landberg, I want to begin. I serve as the chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee, and we have done a lot of work in challenging the large technology platforms in the use of these platforms as it relates to disinformation and radicalization. And so my first question is, are there countries that are conducting really good or successful online counterterrorism programs that we can learn from, or examples we should look at?
I believe certainly there are. Recently we joined the Christchurch Call to Action, and I think working with New Zealand and France on those activities. I think there are countries where we can learn. I think I do want to caution that, for example, related to designations and using that kind of thing to counter some of the activities of these groups. I mean, we cannot go after hate speech on its own, right? And some of our partners can. So some of the capabilities that our partners have, the United States, because of the First Amendment, that's not something we're going to do. So we tend to be more focused on working with social media companies to encourage them to take action. I think when we joined the Christchurch Call to Action, we made really clear that when we were joining it, that meant that we were going to continue to ensure that freedom of expression was, continue to be protected. So I think there's some differences sometimes in our authorities, but I think there's also a lot of information sharing going on, and we're learning from our partners.
Thank you. And again, recently released documents by whistleblower Frances Hogan suggest that Facebook knowingly used recommendation systems and algorithms to push some of its users toward fringe ideologies and extremist groups. And given the widespread use of platforms like Facebook and really the kind of failure of Congress, at least so far, to regulate them in any significant way, Can you just describe what kinds of challenges that these practices create for your work in countering online threats and de-radicalization efforts? And what Congress can do to help mitigate some of the effects you're seeing from these practices? I mean, where their business model incentivizes them to share the most provocative, most dangerous, most untrue content because it has the deepest engagement.
So I'll partly reiterate what I said earlier. I mean, I think we are working with these social media companies to strongly encourage them to enforce their terms of service, which in every case prohibits a hate speech and that kind of radicalizing speech. That's our approach. We have a number of organizations that we work with, including the UN, but there's also a group called GIFT-CT. And in these organizations, we work with them as a group to try to get them to do so. I think that's the right approach. One of the things we try to do is help them, encourage them to support the creation of positive content also to counter the negative content.
But when you say, you're working with these platforms to encourage them to, follow their own policies, I mean, are there things, I mean, it seems as if you shouldn't be at the mercy of their willingness to do this, because what we have seen over and over and over again is they are motivated by a single objective: to grow their companies, increase their profits, increase user engagement, regardless of the content. And they have displayed no willingness to curate the content in any way which protects the public good or which reduces violence or limits the sharing of radical, false information. And so, I mean, clearly you must have thought about having some tools that Congress could give you to not just nudge them, but to prevent them from being platforms that, in fact, facilitate deep radicalization in this country. And what I'm asking you, if you don't have thoughts today, I'd ask you to give it some thought, because we have a responsibility. We can no longer just sort of hope and prod and push and wish that they are going to prevent their platforms from being used to facilitate violence and radicalization and real harm in our country and around the world. We've got to make them stop playing that role. And I think, again, I appreciate your effort to try to make them follow their, but that's not working. These platforms are, so I don't know if you have some thoughts. I don't mean to.
Well, I think they're probably listening to you right now. So I think, it's in their interest to do what you're talking about, to limit hate speech, limit efforts to use their platforms to radicalize individuals, especially radicalize them to violence. So we're going to keep working with them and keep pressing them to do that.
Because as you point out, they have
happy to provide more.
Right. Great. Thank you so much, and I yield back, Mr.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline, for your excellent line of questioning. I'm going to follow up on where Mr. Cicilline left off as we bring this hearing to a close. Mr. Landberg, you're the acting principal deputy coordinator for the Bureau of Counterterrorism. And what you said today, and just now with Mr. Cicilline, was that we've been encouraging the social media companies to take action, that we've strongly encouraged them to enforce their terms of service, and that we've encouraged them to post positive content to counter the negative content. This is a hearing on counterterrorism. You understand, and I'm grateful for all you do, and your thoughtful answers today, and your dedication to public service. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I just want to spend a moment reflecting on the fact that we've seen this increase in Rem v. terrorism and white identity terrorism, so much of it lone actor, so much of it driven online, right? That's correct, right? Yeah. And the response from the Counterterrorism Bureau, trying to prevent acts of terror against American citizens, is that we're strongly encouraging them to enforce their own terms of service. So I'm going to join with Mr. Cicilline in asking you to give a lot of thought to what more can be done beyond the mere encouragement that we've been offering? Because I know, given the thoughtful answers that you've given today and all of the, and your deep knowledge of these issues and all of the ways that you've used the many tools that you do have here and around the world to help keep America safe, that you would use more tools if you had them. That's clear, because you're really good at what you do. But if what we're doing is strongly encouraging companies to enforce their own terms of service, then you need some more tools.
Okay. So I probably should have mentioned, using our foreign assistance funds, we work to build the capabilities of a lot of our law enforcement partners to do online investigations, for example, in the dark web, as part of their investigations and process, going after malified actors. So we do use foreign assistance to do that. When it came to the social media companies, that's why I was answering in that way.
No, I understand. Do you work, Mr. Landberg, can you just share, since we're wrapping this up, is there anything you can share with us more specifically about how you encourage these companies to enforce their terms of service, what you share with them in terms of the real threats to our nation if they fail to live up to their responsibility, even to enforce their own terms of service?
Well, I think this has been mainly with the social media companies, an effort to work collectively with them to deal with this problem. Recognizing that there are some larger companies that have more capabilities than smaller companies, so we've been working with them through the organization I was telling you about, GIF-CT, also through the UN group that we work with to address this issue. As far as trying to force them to do it, I mean, no, we're working collaboratively with them. We work with partners overseas using foreign assistance. In many cases, we have helped, for example, we worked with the Philippines police. They were tracking online radicalization efforts, started tracking certain individuals using our training and assistance, and actually were able to foil a building plot. So, I mean, I think we've had success in that respect.
What I'm getting at, just to try to be a little more specific, is when I know you're working with them, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate that. I readily acknowledge that the companies don't want their services to be used to create dangerous situations and acts of terror. But what I'm asking is, what do you provide to them in those conversations? What is it that you're sharing with them to encourage them to take action? What is it that you're warning them might happen if they don't enforce their terms of service?
So I don't think that we've been very clear about punitive actions.
No, I'm not asking you about, I'm approaching this from a cooperative, I acknowledge the cooperative effort, and I am curious to know, and we've asked you to think about additional tools that you might need, but from a cooperative standpoint, in encouraging them to take these actions, what is it that you're presenting to them? What is it that you're showing them that should lead them to conclude that they need to redouble their efforts to enforce their terms of service and to take action when there is dangerous content?
So we're certainly sharing with them what we know is going on in terms of terrorist use of the internet. So we do have that dialogue about trends we see, how terrorists are using the internet, what groups that we're most concerned about, and how they're operating. And so, yes, there is that dialogue, for sure.
And then finally, there are lots of groups, NGOs, who have their own various forms of expertise, who also work with, provide information to social media companies. Do you interact with those groups? Is there a coordinated effort among among your bureau and among the NGOs who are focused on these issues to provide as much information as possible to these companies about what's actually happening?
Sir, the extent of, there's a lot of coordination going on. The extent of that and how much we work with NGOs, I'd have to get back to you on that.
Okay, I would ask that you do. And then just the last question on this topic of REMV and white identity terrorism. You talked about designations and blocking travel.
Yes.
How many groups have been designated? Have there been actions taken to prevent individuals from traveling to our country or elsewhere?
Yeah, we've designated one group, the Russian Imperial Movement. And we are always looking for opportunities to do more designations, both as groups and also for individuals. Designations is complicated with REMV actors. They've learned lessons from ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. They're more diffuse, unclear command and control often. They use end-to-end encrypt applications to hide their communication. So it's more complex, but we're absolutely looking at opportunities to designate more. On terrorist travel, we have put in place a layered security system worldwide working with partners, and we integrate names of known and suspected terrorists into those databases, working with our partners to prohibit travel.
Great. Well, Mr. Landberg, I really want to thank you. I'm grateful for your appearance today. Really appreciative of your very thoughtful answers. I think that I can speak on behalf of the members in expressing our gratitude for that. And as I said before, immensely grateful for your public service. I will remind all of the members that additional questions, to the extent that any of the members have them, should be submitted within 5 business days, and we'll ask you to respond to those questions in writing. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.